Order, order. Good morning, everyone. Guto Bebb to move the motion.
Mr. Hollowborn, I beg to move that this House has considered the issue of Iran and the proposed nuclear agreements.
The question is that this House has considered Iran and the proposed nuclear agreement. Guto Bebb.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowborn. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this morning. I think this is a very opportune opportunity to look at the issue and to consider the issue once again of the proposed nuclear agreement in relation to Iran. I think it is opportune in terms of the fact that there has been an outline agreement presented on the 2nd of April 2015, and there's an expectation that a full agreement might be reached by the end of this month. So therefore I think it is right and proper that this issue was once again considered by Parliament. And it is in effect a debate which follows on from the very good and very positive backbench business debate that was held in November 2014 during the last Parliament. And since then we've also had a number of questions, parliamentary questions asked, which have been addressed by the government, and in addition a number of statements. And on top of that, in terms of the context, I think it is very important, and it is still very relevant, to consider the report of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which was presented in the last Parliament. So there is a context to this debate, which is a context not only in this place, but also a context in the outside world that we need to be aware of. But as I said, I think it is very opportune that we now have the opportunity to debate this issue once more. And I think in the course of this debate, I will be asking a significant number of questions, which I hope that the Minister will be able to respond to. And I think it is relevant that we highlight these questions before an agreement is finalised, because there are genuine concerns across the House, I would suspect, in relation to some of the detail being presented in relation to what might be part of the proposed agreement. So I think we have to ask the question, to start off, what is the intention of any proposed agreement? And I think this is a crucial issue, because my understanding was that initially the aim of an agreement, a nuclear agreement with Iran, was to deal with the issue of non-proliferation, to ensure that there was no further development of nuclear weapons in countries such as Iran in this context. And yet it would appear that the developments that we are now reading about, it would appear that the discussion has moved from a non-proliferation treaty to something which is more closely related perhaps to an arms control treaty. And I think that's a very, very important development, and not necessarily a positive development, because when the original talks between the P5+1 and Iran were commenced, it was definitely on the basis of a non-proliferation treaty. I will happily give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, congratulating for securing this debate. Does he agree that this proposed deal really just seeks to legitimise Iran's nuclear activity, like being able to enrich and stockpile low-grade uranium, which has no civilian use whatsoever? And we're talking about a country which is one of the world's largest, if not the largest, state sponsor of terrorism.
Legitimate and in order. But what I would say to all the members present is there are a lot of members here, and we only have 90 minutes. So it wouldn't be my intention to call anybody to make a speech who makes an intervention beforehand, because I want to make sure that everybody has their chance to have their say. Guto Bebb.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowborn. I think there is some merit in the points made, but in terms of the contents of the actual agreement, I think that is why I have called this debate today, in order to see what is the view of the Foreign Office of the potential context and content of any proposed debates. But I think a bilateral arms control treaty is not what our partners in the region are looking for. And I think it's fair to say, in preparation for this debate, I was fortunate enough to be briefed by representatives of the Bahrainian government on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And I think it is fair to say that our partner states in the Gulf do have real and specific concerns about the way in which this proposed treaty has moved significantly from what was originally intended. And I think one of the most striking comments made by the representatives of the Bahrainian government was that they felt increasingly as if they were being treated by the P5+1 in a way which was not dissimilar to the way in which Eastern European countries were treated when there were arms control treaties between the US and the Soviet Union. And if that is a development which is concerning our allies in the GCC, then I think it is an issue that the government should take seriously. I will, of course, give way.
The honourable gentleman giving way, and of course I congratulate him on securing this very important debate. He talks about the GCC and also Bahrain, But the other point linked to it is that if you have a state like Iran, which is harboring and sponsoring terrorism, for example, in Yemen, by supporting the Houthi rebels to destabilize the region, as well as in Syria, Iraq, in Lebanon, supporting Hamas in Israel. You can't have an agreement on one hand on nuclear. On the other hand, you have a state sponsoring and harboring terrorism. It's a short-term fix and long-term problem for the international community.
Well, I think the Honourable Member makes a very pertinent point, which was certainly reflected in the discussions I had with the representatives of the Bahrainian government last week. There is a real concern that the intentions, or the good intentions, which have been taken for granted in relation to this treaty, is questioned by some of those Gulf states who have real concerns about the foreign policy objectives, to put it mildly, of Iran in that part of the world. And I think it is important that when we are looking at this potential treaty, we take into account not just the views of the P5+1, but also of partner states in that part of the world. And I think it's also very fair and legitimate. I will, of course, give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. It's very kind of him. Does he not feel that what he has described as the thoughts of the Gulf state are increased by the attitude to the detail of this, which is the centrifuges, and that if Iran is allowed to retain 6,000 plus centrifuges against the original estimate of 1,000, that is clearly a bad sign?
Well, I fully endorse the comments made by my honourable friend. I think the issue of the centrifuges is something I will address in due course. And it is reasonable to say that the proposed 6,000, which are now assumed to be part of a proposed treaty, are significantly in excess of the 1,000 that was originally discussed by the P5+1 when these negotiations started. So that is an issue that does need to be addressed in terms of whether that is actually the case in any proposed treaty. But I think it's also fair to question, and I'm not one who wants to be described as a cynic, but I think it's also fair to question whether this agreement is actually an effort to resolve this issue, or whether it is in effect an effort to ensure a foreign policy legacy for the current American administration. And I think, again, I don't want to be accused of being cynical, and I would be making this contribution in the spirit of the backbench debate that was held in November 2014. I think there's a genuine realisation that we do need an agreement. But does that agreement need to be rushed in order to achieve a foreign policy goal for the US administration, an administration that might not be there for very long? I think we do need some certainty on that issue. And, of course, I'll take an intervention.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. On that point, many of the Gulf states, Bahrain, he talks about as being one, obviously the United Arab Emirates and others, are very nervous about Iran's intention, because they clearly know that we want a deal, but they clearly understand the timetabling as well, i.e. that it would be much easier to leverage something that they would see as advantageous to them if we're working to a timeline that is being judged by legacies or otherwise in the United States of America.
Yes, well, I think my honourable friend makes a very fair point, and I think the key thing is that a proposed treaty must stand and fall on its own merits, and it should not be subject to a timetable which is being pushed on the basis of the priorities of others. And I think that's certainly something that came across in my meeting with representatives of the GCC prior to this debate. So we do need to make sure that this is an agreement which is satisfying the concerns, the real concerns of our allies in the Middle East. But in addition, I think it's certainly also very important to ensure that the indications that a settlement or an agreement has seen major concessions made from the original position outlined by the P5+1 to the current rumours of what will be contained within an agreement. I think it is very important to highlight, or for the government to highlight, what concessions have been offered in return for those concessions that have been clearly made, for example, in relation to the number of centrifuges. I think we do need to have an outline of what concessions have been made. But I think I need to just go back then to the backbench business debate which was held in November 2014. And I'm glad to see that one of the members who secured that debate is actually currently in the chamber, the Honourable Member for South Norfolk. And I think it was a very positive debate where there was a range of opinions expressed about the intentions or otherwise of Iran. There was a range of opinions expressed about the historical context of any proposed deal. And there were fine speeches made highlighting the missed opportunities in the past for an agreement with Iran. And I think it would certainly pay for any member who's interested in this subject to actually reread that debate, which I did do prior to coming here. But I was struck by the very fair summary of that debate, which was actually made by the Minister, who is also in his place, and can I welcome him back to his position in government. But I think he finished that debate, he concluded that debate in an excellent manner by saying quite clearly that it is right that we should leave no stone unturned in the quest to reach an agreement, but we must not and will not do a bad deal. The stakes are too high. And I think those comments can probably be endorsed by everybody in this chamber today. But I think we need to have some certainty that a proposed deal, the outlines of which are being rumoured to include significant concessions, we need to make sure and be reassured, I would argue, that such a compromise is actually the right deal. So what are the main concerns? Well, my honourable friend has already mentioned the issue of centrifuges. And I have to say, this is one of the biggest challenges in this debate. In other words, how do I get myself to pronounce centrifuges correctly? Yeah. But when we looked at the P5+1, initially the aim was to try and have an agreement which would allow Iran to maintain 1,000, possibly 1,500. In the backbench business debate, which was held in November, the then chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee stated that in their report and in the evidence that they had heard, the maximum number of centrifuges should be between 2,000 and 4,000. It is said that 4,500 centrifuges, for example, will allow the production of 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium within a 6-month period, 4,500. And yet we're now hearing the rumour that an agreement will include the allowance of 6,000 of these centrifuges. So you can do the maths. We're not looking at enriched uranium, 25 kilograms within 6 months. We're probably looking at a capacity being retained of achieving that goal in possibly 4 months. So I think there is a real question mark as to why have the demands of the P5+1 changed so dramatically and what concessions have been offered in return. And I think we do need to have a response to that question. Secondly, on the issue of centrifuges, the 14,000 perhaps, which will be made redundant as a result of an agreement which leaves Iran with 6,000, how many of those will be dismantled? If they are not to be dismantled, then what is to stop them being recommissioned? How long will that process take? So again, there are significant questions to be asked in relation to the issue of centrifuges, both the allowance of 6,000 perhaps, but also what happens to the 14,000 which will be remaining within Iranian hands. And I think it is important to state that 30 countries in the world do have a civilian nuclear programme. And the point was made very forcibly by the former Honourable Member for Blackburn in the debate in November, that any sovereign country has a right to pursue an energy policy. And I would agree with that point. But of the 30 countries who have a civilian nuclear programme, only 11 have the capacity to enrich their own fuel. And the question I would ask is, on what basis do the P5+1 come to the conclusion that on the track record that the Iranian government has on this issue of allowing monitoring, of allowing third parties to look at their military capacity in relation to the enrichment of uranium, on what basis do the P5+1 now believe that Iran should become a 12th country with that capacity? I will, of course, take an intervention.
On that very point, would he not also share my concern that Iran remains a premier sponsor of terror and that we ought to particularly look at this question in that light when we're comparing it with other nations?
Well, I would certainly accept that the goodwill and the good intention of Iran should be taken into account in the context of their continued support for terrorism in many parts of the Middle East, which is a key concern of, as I said, of many of our partner nations. And I will take a quick intervention.
Very quick intervention. We sometimes get stuck on numbers of centrifuges. Since the negotiations began to this date, the technology around centrifuges, and I have to declare an interest, I'm a chemical engineer by background, the technology itself has so far advanced that actually a single centrifuge now is so much more productive than what used to be in place when the negotiations first started.
Well, indeed, my honourable friend makes a very important point, which is indeed the point I was going to come on to, because the issue in terms of research and development as part of any agreement is very necessary. What guarantees can be offered in terms of the development of more advanced centrifuges? If there are no guarantees included in any agreement in relation to the development of much more advanced centrifuges, then again there is a real question, because if we are dealing with an agreement which is trying to curtail the breakout time for Iran to develop a nuclear capacity, then the issue of the sophistication and the development of centrifuges is crucial. And yet there is no detail, as far as I can see, in relation to what sort of monitoring will be undertaken to the issue of research and development. And I will, of course, take an intervention.
I thank my friend for securing the debate, but he raised, I think, a more broad question here of research and development, and the importance of not just being retrospective in how the agreement reviews that, but being prospective as well in terms of making sure the agreement is future-proofed, to ensure that improvements in technology, improvements in productivity, improvements in capacity are all taken into account, and that sufficient protections are put in place against the future capacity in developing uranium and indeed other harmful technologies.
And again, I would accept the comments made by my honourable friend, and I would say that to a large extent, one of my concerns is the issue of monitoring, and indeed the access to monitors to allow that type of review to be conducted. And there are real concerns as to whether that monitoring will be of an acceptable nature. We also need to identify the issue of the nuclear sites. You know, there are two nuclear sites, which Natanz and Fordo, which are now to be retained, if my understanding of the proposed deal is correct. So again, there's a question to the government, to the minister in this issue. If such a concession has been made, then again, what concessions have been offered in return by the Iranians in order to facilitate that agreement? Yes, of course I'll give way.
First of all, congratulate my honourable friend in securing the debate, but also in approaching this in a very balanced way. He was good enough to accept that mistakes in the past have been made by both sides, and some of the concessions that were offered, which perhaps we in the West refused to take up decades ago, we would now gladly take up, and things have moved on. But mistakes have been made. But can I suggest this to him? It is terribly important we have the proper safeguards in place in any agreement to protect particularly friendly neighbours. And I accept that point 100%. We've got to focus on the laser light. But we must not lose sight also of the benefits of reaching some sort of agreement with Iran, because there could be many benefits across the region, a region that is becoming increasingly unstable, and we cannot ignore the fact that Iran is a major regional power, which we ourselves created with our misguided invasion of Iraq.
Well, I would agree with many of the points made by the honourable gentleman, and I would agree that the benefits of a good deal are worth fighting for. The concern, I suspect, that many members have is the nature of that proposed deal and the certainty that any proposed deal does offer to neighbouring states which have real concerns which are acknowledged by the honourable gentleman. So I accept the points made about mistakes in the past. I accept the importance of having a proper deal in place. But I think the key point is that the deal has to be acceptable to all, and it has to be a deal which gives confidence in the long term for other countries in that part of the world. And I think there is also a concern, I think, about the proposed length of the deal. We're looking at a deal which is possibly going to be limited to 10 years. And again, in the context of nuclear capacity and the development of nuclear capacity, we have to ask this ourselves whether 10 years is reasonable, is it enough? And in the context of a deal which does nothing, from what I gather, to deal with the ballistic missile capabilities of Iran, again, there's a real question as to whether 10 years is sufficient. So I have to ask the question then, if the aim is to secure the right deal, can we justify the type of concessions that we have been reading about? The issue of verification has been touched upon by honourable members in their interventions, but again, we need to have certainty from the Foreign Office and from the government that there is confidence that the degree of verification that will be allowed within any agreement will be acceptable. And again, the track record of the Iranian regime does not give confidence on this issue. Only last month, from my understanding of those who often speculate and comment upon what goes on in Iran, only last month the IAEA were actually refused access. And the Ayatollah Khamenei actually said, and I quote, "No inspection of any military site and interviews with nuclear scientists will be allowed." And that must give real cause for concern if we are to have a proper verification process in any agreement. If we have an agreement with a proper verification process, then that agreement has to be maintained and it has to be foolproof. And again, the track record is not one that gives us much confidence. And the other question I think we need to address is whether an agreement which is compromising to the extent that appears to be the case, whether such an agreement actually contributes to an escalation in the arms race in the region rather than a reduction of any tensions. And again, I would say that it's worth pointing out that the agreement appears to be stating quite clearly that to control Iran, to put Iran in a position where they are within 6 months of a breakout for the next 10 years, is an acceptable outcome. And the concern I would have, and I think this again is a concern that is shared by honourable members, is that we would end up in a situation where we have an arms race, not to produce a nuclear weapon, but an arms race to be in a position where other countries in the region will be within 6 months of a breakout. And I think it is worth mentioning the fact that Prince Turki Al-Fazi from Saudi Arabia stated quite clearly, whatever the Iranians have, we will have too. And I think, again, that is a comment which should be taken seriously by the governments when they actually assess the merits or otherwise of any proposed deal. And then finally, I think it is worth stating that any proposed deal has to satisfy the needs of the P5+1, it has to satisfy the needs of a very unstable region, it has to satisfy the needs of our allies in the region. But I think the real test is that it has to satisfy the original intention, which was to ensure that Iran did not develop a nuclear capacity. And I think, again, I can only quote Dr. Bruno Tertres. My pronunciation is really being challenged this morning. But he stated very clearly, we must not ignore the lessons of history. Nuclear-capable countries never stay at the threshold for very long. Now, originally, the intention of the P5+1 was to ensure that Iran did not develop a nuclear capacity. Looking at the bare bones of a proposed agreement, it would appear to be the case that the P5+1 are now willing to accept a situation in which Iran is at the threshold of a nuclear breakout, but that threshold will be maintained for the next 10 years. I think the words of Dr. Tertres is very important in that context. Countries who develop a capacity to develop a nuclear weapon will almost invariably end up developing that nuclear capacity. I will, of course, give way.
With both Libya and South Africa.
Well, I think it's an interesting point, but I suspect that the changes which happened certainly in the context of South Africa were quite significant in terms of what happened politically in South Africa, and I would argue that that made a real difference to the way in which South Africa viewed their position in the world. I suspect that the changes that happened in South Africa are not going to happen anytime soon in the context of Iran, and therefore I think that those comments are still worth bearing in mind. So therefore, what I would ask is, what assurances can the Foreign Office give us that this proposed deal, the outlines of which have been given, to what extent do the Foreign Office have confidence that that deal will be for the long-term interest, not only of Iran, but for the neighbouring states within the Middle East? Because if those assurances cannot be given, then there are real questions as to whether we can support any proposed deal. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered Iran and the proposed nuclear agreement. Now, I will be calling Guto Bebb at the end of the debate for an extra 2 minutes to sum up what has been debated. There are 7 members who wish to contribute. I don't want to call the front benches any later than 10:40, with the debate closing at 11. So I'm going to introduce a 6-minute limit. If there are lots of interventions, I'm afraid I'll have to cut that to 5. But let's start off with 6 minutes, and I call first Dr. Liam Fox.
Mr. Chairman, the election of Hassan Rouhani as President of Iran in 2013 was heralded by certain sections of the Western commentariat as a landmark moment. Here was a government we would be able to do business with and bring Iran in from the cold. And calls for caution from seasoned Iran observers were lost in the all-too-familiar triumph now of wishful thinking over critical analysis and the superficial obsession with media-friendly projection. And fast forward to 2015, and it has become clear that the country's direction has not changed. It was never going to, and those who expected change fundamentally misunderstood the structure of Iranian power. President Rouhani was destined to only ever have a limited influence in a state dominated by the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guard. And Khamenei has shown an amazing ability for consistency that Western politicians can only dream of. His consistency in his belief for the purity of the Iranian Revolution, his hatred for the United States, and his contempt for the existence of the State of Israel. And neither has Rouhani's administration brought any respite for the Iranian people. Executions in 2014 left Iran as the world's leader in executions per capita. Freedoms that we take for granted in the West continue to be aggressively curtailed. Persecution of those who supported the Green Movement and their families continue relentlessly, and the Western media seem curiously detached from or even indifferent to the plight of their savagely repressed Iranian colleagues. Iran remains a sponsor of state terrorism, providing financial, logistic and material support to Islamist terror groups across the region, including those targeting British forces when they were in Afghanistan and Iraq. Iran persists in its refusal to respond adequately to the international community's fears about its nuclear programme. And Iran's nuclear intentions cannot be seen without the context of its support for terror proxies, arguably the defining feature of Iran's foreign policy, and the risks are clear. So anxieties over Iran's nuclear intentions are well placed. Iran's extensive nuclear programme features many of the key components required to facilitate the domestic production of a nuclear weapon, possession of quantities of enriched materials, knowledge to convert enriched materials into weaponised form, and the development and possession of a delivery mechanism in the form of ballistic missiles. The country has a long history of clandestine nuclear work. Two of the nuclear-related facilities at Natanz in Iraq, at the centre of the international community's concerns, were constructed secretly in a clear breach of the spirit, if not the letter, of the NPT obligations. For years, Iran used these facilities to enrich uranium to levels and quantities beyond those required for a legitimate and peaceful civil nuclear programme. Iran routinely neglects its obligations to cooperate with the IAEA, including repeatedly denying inspectors access to contentious nuclear-related facilities, such as the one at Parchin, at which it's suspected of having previously undertaken tests related to triggers for nuclear weapons. It is logical to assume that Iran's intentions are to develop a nuclear weapons capability, and any claims that its intentions are exclusively peaceful should not be regarded as credible. While we may have seen a less confrontational diplomatic posture over the nuclear issue than under the former president, the real position has not changed. Iran must not be allowed to dictate the terms of any final permanent nuclear agreement. They have not earned the benefit of the doubt. A permanent deal must cover, in meticulous detail, all elements of Iran's nuclear-related activity, including its ballistic missile programme. Ballistic missiles are, after all, the final critical stage component of the weaponisation process and prohibited under the UN Security Council Resolution 1929. Omitting such sensitive technology from a final agreement would be inexcusable, and the Iranians are masters at manipulating the detail of any agreement to their advantage. Likewise, to be wrong-footed over this long-term issue due to short-term considerations of potential Iranian help with ISIS would be a colossal error. We have a number of very clear concerns. The time limitation of the agreement is merely to put off the dreadful day that we have all been dreading, to allow, as my honourable friend has said, the number of catalysts to remain at 6,000 or above is an utterly unacceptable risk and allows breakout at almost any time. Verification, anything less than unfettered access, is completely unacceptable because we have seen from the Iranians' past behaviour how they will manipulate any weakness in the terms of the IAEA's access. And then we have Khamenei himself. He has already talked about how sanctions must be lifted immediately, that any agreement is made, and that's tearing up the terms of the proposed agreement before it's finally put down on paper. It's a sign of things to come, and we should not be giving the benefit of the doubt to such a leader. Mr. Chairman, a nuclear-armed Iran would make an absolute mockery of the NPT, not least because it would be likely to be followed into the nuclear club in short order by its regional neighbours, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Turkey. The prospect of a nuclear arms race in one of the world's most unstable regions, where the likelihood of the use of such weapons is probably greatest, should be of concern to us all. The stakes are enormous. It's no exaggeration to say that the fate of international security rests on the P5+1's ability to secure the right deal. Anything less would reshape our whole understanding of international security with dire consequences. The P5+1 must not blink. A bad deal is worse than no deal. Appeasement has a very bad track record.
Richard Bacon. Richard Bacon.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and participate in this debate. And I've listened to it with interest, and I've been tempted to intervene on a number of occasions, but didn't, because I observed your earlier
injunction. I'd like to just start with a couple of facts. Iran is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The same cannot be said of Israel, the same cannot be said of Pakistan, the same cannot be said of India. Iran is surrounded by countries which have nuclear weapons. To the north, Russia; to the west, Israel; to the east, Pakistan; and to the south, the United States, through its US Navy. One would think that the desire in a tough neighbourhood to be able to defend oneself would be quite normal. And indeed, my right honourable friend said a moment ago, if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, it would be rapidly followed by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. And I think that that is probably correct. But when you listen to the debate, one might think that the Iranians are not sentient or thinking people. One might have thought that it hadn't occurred to them that if they got nuclear weapons, it would be rapidly followed by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. One might have thought that only we had heard Prince Faisal when he said, whatever the Iranians have, we will have. When in fact they are in the region, they are more directly affected by any of this than we are. So I think we can take it as read, actually, that Iran will have a rather precise understanding and a rather precise calibration of the consequences of its actions. And I must say, Mr. Hollowburn, I welcome very much the fact that the Iranians and the Saudi foreign ministers met in Oman recently. I'd just like to quote from Saeed Hossein Mousavian's book on the Iranian nuclear crisis, when he said this in a section at the very end of his book under the heading, An End to Double Standards. And I quote, "The fact that the P5+1 countries maintain strategic and aid relations with Israel, India, and Pakistan, which have nuclear weapons and are not parties to the NPT, while at the same time they pressure Iran, which has not acquired nuclear weapons, sends a message to other countries that once they get the bomb, they are immune." And he goes on towards the concluding paragraph of his entire book. "I believe that P5+1 handling of the nuclear issue has been bedeviled by US reluctance to give sufficient weight to accumulating evidence that since 2003, Iran has decided to respect its NPT obligation to refrain from manufacturing or otherwise acquiring nuclear weapons. This misjudgment freezes the P5+1 into positions which preclude any movement towards the areas of mutual interest with Iran that I am convinced exist." And as my honourable friend who's moving this debate said, we did allude to some of those areas of mutual interest in the debate on the 6th of November. I hope that there is a degree of flexibility in the negotiations, suggests that maybe that misjudgment has been suspended, and that while we need to keep our eyes open, there's the possibility that we might find a mutually satisfactory deal. Jack Straw, no longer sadly in the House of Commons, said in the debate on the 6th of November, and I quote, at column 997, he said, "In 2005, Iran had fewer than 200 centrifuges." He was actually pointing out something which Foreign Minister Zarif had said to him in January last year. In 2005, Iran had fewer than 200 centrifuges. After 8 years of sanctions, it now has 18,800 centrifuges. Now, of course, my right honourable friend will say, well, why on earth would they do that if they're not interested in getting nuclear weapons? And the short answer to that is the same reason that Vladimir Putin plays silly buggers on the international stage. Because he can. Because Iran has been treated like a pariah state for many, many years. Several people have already referred to terrorism, including my honourable friend, the member for Norwich North. They were described earlier in this debate as the premier sponsor of terrorism. Now, it's true that Iran maintains relations with Hamas in Gaza, and it retains relations with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. But I don't think that anyone would suggest that either Hamas or Hezbollah, although we know that they are in groups engaged in terrorism, are the premier threat to world peace through terrorism at the moment. It's also true that Iran has relations with the Houthis, who are, depending on your definition, Shia. You will meet Iranians I did in Tehran in December, who will say that the Houthis are not actually Shia. And when we had the visit of Iranian members of parliament to the Foreign Office, to Westminster in March this year, they made this very point in the Foreign Office, that actually, depending on your definition, Houthis are not necessarily Shia. But the reason why they are engaged with the Houthis in Yemen is because they think, rightly, Mr. Hollowbone, that Yemen is being used by Al-Qaeda and IS as an extended training base. Whoever it was, and forgive me, Mr. Hollowbone, because I can't remember who said it, whoever thinks that Iran is the premier sponsor of terrorism should look around. One might be forgiven for thinking, no one actually said it, one might be forgiven for thinking, I will give way in a second, one might be forgiven for thinking that the present firestorm in the Middle East, that the fact that we've got the most brutal war going on, people being beheaded, being crucified, is a direct consequence of Iran, and it is not.
Order. I think Mr. Bacon was about to give way to Chloe Smith.
Yes, I was.
Which is fine. But then, in responding to Chloe Smith, could Mr. Bacon quickly conclude his speech?
I will.
Chloe Smith.
My intervention is extremely short, Mr. Hollowbone. It is to point out that I believe I referred to Iran as a premier sponsor. That, I hope, casts some illumination on the notion that there are various sources of threat in this world, and I hope he considers all of them in his following remarks.
Well, I will, but my final point, Mr. Hollowbone, and I will observe your injunction, is that Iran was in the front line against the Taliban. Iran was in the front line against Al-Qaeda. And Iran is now in the front line against IS, one of the most brutal Stone Age regimes we have seen in modern history, and which exists as a direct consequence of our having invaded Iraq in 2003 with President Bush and smashed the country into small pieces.
Thank you. Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone. It's a pleasure to take part in this debate, and I compliment my honourable friend for Aberconwy for securing this debate. And I certainly agreed with the first two speeches in this debate. I didn't agree with a great deal that the honourable gentleman had to say. In fact, I would describe his speech as complacent in parts, particularly in his what appeared to be a defence of the Iranian regime's actions compared to other countries. And I think it's very complacent to dismiss away the Iranian regime's behaviour in terms of sponsoring terrorism and supporting murder of individuals around their region, around the world. Just let me finish my point, and then I will give way. To seemingly dismiss that away on the basis of the fact that Iran is on the front line against ISIS, who are no doubt, as he said, a cruel and vicious organisation, and I'll give way to him on that point.
Since he just accused me of supporting murder. Those were the words. The tape will show it. Could he just draw attention to precisely which words you think I used that lent support to murder?
No, I didn't accuse the honourable gentleman. I accused the Iranian regime, which I said he seemingly seemed to be defending, of being engaged in the support of mass murder. Certainly not my honourable friend, and if he looks at the record, I'm sure he'll see that. I again congratulate my honourable friend for his debate, and I agreed with pretty much everything he had to say. It's not the first debate on Iran he and I have taken part in. What I would say is slightly frustrating as one of the members of the P5+1 is that we've had very few opportunities in this House to debate the detail of what is emerging, or even to raise our concerns throughout the negotiation process. And I do think, Mr. Hollowbone, it should worry us all greatly that in the lead up to the deadline on June 30th, there are still many issues that remain outstanding. There are not just, Mr. Hollowbone, clear discrepancies between the expectations and demands of the various parties to this negotiating process, but many of the proposed parameters are also worthy of criticism. At this late stage, very late stage, you could say, we've seen increasingly concerning reports emerging. We saw an IAEA, and I apologise with my flat vowels, it's very hard to get all those vowels out together. We saw an IAEA report from this month has revealed that Tehran's stockpile of nuclear fuel has increased by 20%, which is already over the last 18 months, since these negotiations have began, points which have been made by other speakers today. And worryingly, the news is in complete contradiction to President Obama's contention that the nuclear programme had been frozen during this period. And I remember in previous debates, myself and other colleagues across the House had said that we expected exactly this would happen. Of particular concern, however, Mr Hollowburn, are the very many reports of Iran's intransigence towards the verification of the so-called possible military dimensions and the continued blocking of the IAEA access to the country's military sites in order to carry out its crucial investigations. I think in a previous debate I had quoted from previous reports saying exactly the same thing. So I'd like to ask the Minister, how can we possibly ensure that Iran's nuclear programme is what it says it is when the IAEA is unable to determine the true extent of Iran's historic research into nuclear weaponry or to calculate the breakout time properly? And I remember, and I'm drawn back to the words of the former Canadian, sadly now former Canadian Foreign Minister, who, on his assessment of this process, stated that past actions predict future actions, and that Iran had not earned the right, I've now forgotten the quote in my head, Mr Hollowburn. I'm still very tired from a recent long journey I took. Had not earned the right to... I'll come back to it in a moment. I do apologise. Since the announcement of the proposed parameters in April, Iranian officials have avowedly rejected any cooperation with the IAEA's crucial investigations. This justifies the IAEA's long-held concerns about the Iranian regime's true intentions. And only on Sunday of this past week, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, Brigadier General Masoud Jazayeri, again, being from Yorkshire, we're not particularly good with anything that's not English, reiterated the regime's position that permission to visit Iran's military centres will definitely never be issued for any kind of access, even if it runs counter to the acceptance of the additional protocol. It begs the question, of course, Mr Hollowburn, what have the Iranians got to hide, as the international community makes numerous concessions to Iran, a country which, as my honourable friend from Aberconwy points out and others, is in the grip of a fundamentalist regime, and a regime that has sponsored terrorism around the world, particularly in its own region. But a country that's still in the grip of this fundamentalist regime continues to hang its political prisoners, as we've made reference to in previous debates, and fund terror groups across the Middle East. I'd like to ask the Minister then, given everything that the P5+1 and the West is seemingly expected to concede, what concessions are the Iranians expected to make in return for this? And I would come back to the words of the Canadian Foreign Minister, who urged former Canadian Minister, who urged extreme caution in how we approach this, and I hope that he'll have those words and warnings very much to mind when he responds to this debate. Thank you.
Dr Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr Hollowburn. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and indeed I congratulate the honourable member for bringing this debate. But this isn't the first time that we've actually discussed this here in Westminster Hall. Back on the 26th of February 2014, indeed, I initiated a debate upon this issue on the interim programme. So it's very hard not to repeat oneself about the issue, and indeed many members today have already outlined many of the issues of concern. So thinking about this yesterday, I decided to approach it from a completely different point of view, and that is the environmental issues surrounding a nuclear Iran. Now, indeed, the Iranian regime has announced that they are interested in the construction of nuclear technology for energy consumption. A civilian nuclear Iran that only seeks capability for peaceful uses. But in this age of environmental sustainability and renewals, it strikes me as perverse that such claims are being made for the justification of a nuclear program in the Middle East. The country is rich in its natural supply of minerals, oils and gas, and there is an abundance of possibilities in the country's scope to produce renewable energy from wind and sun. The opportunities are infinite, as the production of energies from these natural resources is not only cheaper, but also much safer for the environment. Iran can secure not only its domestic energy supply, but possibly the regional supply of energy without resorting to nuclear technology. We only have to look at the country's current nuclear facilities to consider how safe an expanded nuclear industry in the country would be. The Bushehr nuclear plant, which lies on the coastal region of the Persian Gulf south to Tehran, is a good example. There have been huge safety concerns about the plant associated with the construction of the plant itself, its aging equipment, and indeed understaffing. The Centre for Energy and Security Studies, a Russian independent think tank, explained the construction delays of the plant as partly due to a, and I quote, shortage of skilled Russian engineering and construction specialists with suitable experience. In 2010, the IAEA noted that the facility was understaffed. Therefore, it's clear from this that Iran itself does not have the human capacity for a nuclear industry. Leaders from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries have also expressed fears that a serious nuclear accident at the Bushehr plant would spread radiation throughout the region. Bushehr is closer to the 6 Arab capitals of the Kuwait City, Riyadh, Manama, Doha, Abu Dhabi and Muscat than it is to Tehran. The United States Geological Survey and NASA characterized the geology of the plant as near the boundary of 2 tectonic plates, the Arabian Plate and the Eurasian Plate. The Bushehr plant could be the next Chernobyl of Fukushima and has the potential to contaminate vast swathes of the Middle East in the event of an explosion. Iran's desire to acquire nuclear technology is not so that the country can match the technological achievements of the West, but we all know it is an overt attempt to challenge the military capabilities of other countries and to establish itself as a presence in the geopolitics of the Middle East. The nuclear program has many attractions for the President and the Supreme Leader. I won't do.
Given that Egypt is probably the most populous country in the Middle East, given its strategic position, occupying one entire side of the Gulf, does it surprise him that Iran might want to have an important role in the strategic geopolitics of the region? Does it surprise him?
No, it doesn't surprise me. It's just I worry about their intentions in their role, which I will come to in the rest of my speech. As I said, the nuclear program has many attractions for the President and the Supreme Leader. Internally, it increases self-confidence within elements of the regime's core supporters, such as the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Quds Force, and the Mobilization Force. Externally, it boosts its prestige of the regime in the eyes of fundamentalist militant sympathizers such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. So yes, I do agree, they do want that prestige and influence. It can also be used for the blackmail of regional countries by raising a threat of a localized nuclear attack. It allows Iran to become a dominant voice in the Persian Gulf and could ensure the ascendancy of Iran in the global community as it seeks to cajole and influence. Most of all, it can be used as a tool to sabotage the peace process in the Middle East and give advantage to Iran to dictate their terms and destabilize order in the region, especially in countries like Israel. So the deal being proposed makes no reference to Iran's role as a leading sponsor of state terrorism, as mentioned by the honourable members for Filton, Bradley Stoke and Gilliam and Raynham. While the negotiations in Switzerland were occurring, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels were actually seizing control of the Yemeni capital. Iran was extending its presence in Iraq, and Iran attempted to establish a new front in the Golan Heights in coordination with the terror group Hezbollah. So once again, I agree, they are seeking to exert their influence. The regime is known to provide financial and material support to extremist Islamic terrorist organisations in the Middle East, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the insurgency in Afghanistan and Iraq. Iran reportedly provides Hezbollah with up to £200 million a year and spends up to £35 billion to prop up the Assad regime, and between 2006 and 2011 financed Hamas with up to $300 million on an annual basis. Iran actively sponsors international terrorist groups committed to the destruction of Israel and acts as proxies for the Islamic Republic. However, it's not just me that has concerns about the Iranian regime and its attainment of a nuclear weapon. The International Atomic Energy Agency and the UN Security Council and many other Western countries have also long-standing concerns. In November 2014, the IAEA Director General called on Iran to increase its cooperation with the agency and to provide timely access to all relevant information, documentation, sites, materials and personnel. Iran does not act in any way to allay the fears of us sceptics. It has repeatedly denied IAEA inspectors access to key nuclear sites, including Parchin, where it is believed to have conducted tests involving triggers for nuclear weapons. These are legitimate concerns, and Iran needs to demonstrate the exclusively peaceful civilian nature of its nuclear program and intentions before it can be considered a possible normal non-nuclear weapons state. However, it will not do that, and as such, I remain highly concerned about the deal, as indeed other members here today. The verification program is not enough, and Iran's failure to address the potential military dimensions to its program undermines the IAEA's ability to verify Iran's nuclear program and accurately calculate its breakout time. Iran needs to make concrete progress on the disclosure of its weaponization activities prior to receiving sanctions reliefs, because an agreement that ignores Iran's past weaponization work would risk being unverifiable. And until these issues are resolved, I appeal once again to the Minister, as I did to the Prime Minister on the floor of the House of Commons, to not enable Iran to become a nuclear power. We should be very wary of their intentions, and as I said to the Prime Minister, that the road between a civilian nuclear Iran and a military nuclear Iran is a very short one. And I repeat the words of the Honourable Member for Somerset North when he said it would be better to have no deal than a bad deal.
Neil Parish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollowburn. It's good to serve under your chairmanship. Can I thank also the honourable friend from Aberconwy for securing this debate this morning. I just want to really make the sort of principles behind the whole of this agreement that's coming about, because I think American presidents in their second term are very dangerous, dare I say it, because I think they are looking for legacies, and especially ones that probably have difficulty in having a legacy. They look even harder. And I think we have to be very, very careful that this is not what this is about. And I have got much respect for my honourable friend from South Norfolk, a great friend of mine, but I disagree with him entirely when is there going to be a pecking order in terrorism as to which ones are the worst? I think not. And what worries me is that in our desire, and quite rightly, to have Iranian help to deal with ISIS, are we actually being blind as to what is actually happening there in Iran? And I think we'd have to be very, very careful if we take that particular line.
Different way. And this point that's been made before, that Iran is supporting the international community to defeat Daesh or Fash, I think it's completely wrong, because if one looks at the G7 statement, it said you have to first defeat the Assad regime to then defeat Daesh. And as long as Iran is supporting the Assad regime, you can't then defeat Fash or Daesh. So I think that point has to be very, very clear.
Yes, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I think the Middle East is so complex, and I think when you have a state like Iran, which will sponsor terrorism, and if you just sort of, it's something perhaps none of us necessarily want to actually foresee, but the idea of Iran actually having a nuclear weapon, actually being capable of using it, with its attitude towards its neighbours, especially Israel. I mean, the idea is just abominable. And why do they need so much enriched uranium? You know, we can do the figures here all day, and I don't intend to go into them again, but why do they need it? I don't believe they need it just to create nuclear power stations. They want to enrich that uranium. Why don't they allow proper access for us to see what was going on? Because if we were allowed better access, then we could stand up in this chamber and say what a delight it is we've been all over Iran and we've seen exactly what they are enriching and what they're not. But we have no real idea, because we're not allowed access to it. We've got a fairly good estimate of what might be going on, and that in itself is far too much. And you take the Bashar, I'm having the same trouble as my honourable friend from the north of England. I'm from the west of England, and all these words are rather long to pronounce. But the Bashir nuclear power station, I mean, it's Russian technology. Perhaps I'm going to upset everybody here this morning, not including the Americans and now the Russians. But I'm not always delighted with Russian technology. I'm not always delighted with Russian nuclear power stations. And the idea of all this combination together, it doesn't bode well. And it's no good for us to sit here and put our rose-coloured glasses on and say, let's do a deal with Iran. I believe almost at all costs, dare I say it. And that's why, I've got great faith in our minister here this morning that Britain has to really stand up and actually be sensible about this. Because if we are actually going to reduce the amount of terrorism in the Middle East, if we're actually going to make the Middle East more secure. What we cannot have, possibly have, is Iran with the capability in the future of making a nuclear bomb. And we, in this agreement, it's talking about 10 to 15 years. I mean, 10 to 15 years of control is just not enough. I mean, 10 to 15 years, it blows away in the wind as fast as we can blink, almost with a blinking of an eye. You know, and I'd love to think that in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, we'd be talking about a wonderfully peaceful Middle East, and perhaps, you know, call me a little cynic, perhaps, but cynical, because I don't believe necessarily that will be the case. I do hope it's the case, but I think we've got to stand up to these states. I mean, you know, it's no good sitting here and saying, oh, it's okay, let's have an agreement. Let's brush all those problems under the carpet because they don't really exist. Oh, yes, they do exist. They are there, and they will have that capability. And I think that is something I really want us to debate this, and we have debated it very thoroughly this morning, but I think we want to have our eyes open, and I want to hear from the Minister what the British position is, not just one that, you know, we all come together and it's all very nice and cosy, and it's lovely, and we all feel warm because we're getting an agreement. No. What is actually happening in Iran? What are we doing to press as to what are we doing about getting those inspectors in there? Because until we've got those inspectors in there and know exactly what's going on, I can't see how possibly we can sign any agreement. And so that's what I would particularly like to hear from the Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Holderman.
Tom Tugendhat.
Mr. Holderman, thank you very much for calling me to speak in this debate. And I'm going to pick up, if I may, on a slight theme that my honourable friend from Tiverton highlighted, which is the 10-year timeline. I'd just like to say that 10 years ago, I had been in Kabul for a few months, beginning to set up the National Security Council of Afghanistan and supporting that government to stand on its own 2 feet in matters of security. And one of the biggest threats then, as it won't surprise many of my honourable friends, was indeed the penetration of Iranian agents and Iranian activists within the Afghan system. I have not got immediate recent experience, but I have no reason to believe that that has changed in any way. Because what we're dealing with here is not a country that is behaving in the ways of a post-Westphalian system in Western Europe. What we're dealing with here is a country that has visions of itself and ideas of itself that go back way beyond what we in Europe are talking about. We're talking about Cyrus the Great, we're talking about the Sasanian Empire. The Sasanian Empire, as you will remember, no doubt, Mr. Hollowbone, had in its first major expansion into Yemen in the 570s, the year of the elephant, indeed, the year that's often celebrated because, of course, it's also the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. And that reach, that expansionism, is not something that the present regime in Iran have forgotten. Quite the reverse. It is something that they echo in every word that they say and in every speech that they make. So when I hear that they are not interested in the expansionism, I look merely at the maps of the Sasanian Empire and at later empires of Iran, and I see where their interests lie. And their interests lie all the way from Delhi all the way to Turkey. Now, for us, those impacts are very serious because, of course, our world has changed since then too. Our friends now lie on both sides of the Persian Gulf. Our friends now lie on all parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and indeed on the other side as well, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And that means that for us, the Iranian question is no longer a foreign question about which we know little. It is a personal, immediate, and local question. And it is that because the nuclearization of Iran, were it to happen, would trigger, as my friend has said, my honourable friend has said, would trigger the nuclearization of 2 further countries that matter immediately, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, both of whom would probably get what they have already paid for, which is a Pakistan nuclear bomb. Now, that is an extremely threatening situation, not just for us, but actually for many other friends in the region. And in fact, this is not, as many people think, a question about Israel. It's much more fundamentally a question about Arab sovereignty and Arab states in the region. It is also, however, and this is another point that seems to be overlooked by many of those people who seem to think that the rights of an Iranian theocratic regime should become supreme. It is also to ignore the rights of the Iranian people. Because people have now forgotten that the first of the so-called Arab Spring revolutions was in fact the Green movement in Iran. And you will remember, I know, Mr. Chairman, that the Iranian government crushed the Green movement with extreme brutality. And it was able to do so because it has constantly played, certainly under Ahmadinejad, it has constantly played the cities against the countryside. It has recruited the revolutionary militias, the Basij, from the countryside, and used them time and again to crush movements of not even liberalism, movements of gentle reform in the cities, and particularly in Tehran. And they did that again in the Green Movement, in the Green Revolution. And what this does, what this proposed treaty does, is to endorse a theocratic regime that is anathema to peace in the region and anathema to civil rights in its own country. So it is not just incumbent on our government to stand up for ourselves in this, nor even just incumbent on us, of course.
When he says an anathema to peace in the region, I immediately think of Saudi and Gulf financing for IS. When he says an anathema to civil rights, I immediately think of the civil rights that don't exist in Saudi Arabia. Why does he think that Iran uniquely gets picked out?
My honourable friend is right that the rest of the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula is very far from an island of perfection in a world that would otherwise be a dark spot. Indeed, there are other states that have serious issues, and I will not in any way seek to relieve the pressure on the Salafi funding of various regimes around the area. I completely agree with him that these things are inimical to our interests, and indeed the pressure that the Islamic State, as it's being laughably called, Daesh as it should be called, is putting on our own interests in the region is absolutely abhorrent. But the idea that somehow my enemy's enemy is my friend is also for the birds. It is completely wrong. Because actually what we are watching is a continuation of a period of violence that started with the battles of Karbala and the deaths of Hassan and Hussein. And what we don't want to do is to be getting ourselves involved instead and saying, no, everybody can nuclearize themselves. Indeed, he makes the point for me that to nuclearize one would be to encourage further problems for the whole area. So I do say, again, that to allow Iran to get nuclear weapons would be anathema to the peace of the region, anathema to the civil rights of the society, and anathema to our interests. So I would urge the Minister, who I'm very glad to see in his place, as I know he understands the region extremely well, I would urge him to look hard at what Her Majesty's government can do, not only to reinforce our position as a voice for peace in the region, but also what can we do to reassure our friends, not just Gulf countries, but across North Africa as well, that we will not abandon them. We will not be fair weather friends. And if Iran does insist on pushing this, what will we do to stand up for them? Because we're not just standing up for them, we're standing up for ourselves. Thank you. I will give way.
Raymond Chishti.
To the Honourable Gentleman, in giving way once again, when he says we should support our international allies around the region, around the world, does he also agree with me that we need to learn lessons from what happened before? For example, the international community stood by when Iran backed the Maliki government in Iraq, which led to the crushing of the Sunnis, which then led to helped the rise of Daesh and Fash, which is the massive problem we have now. So therefore, we have an international duty to ensure that we support our friends and colleagues where there is oppression going on, and ensure that we deal with these policies and issues at an early stage.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making an excellent point there, and all I can do is urge honourable members to read The Unravelling by Emma Skye, a plug for a book of a friend of mine that is absolutely outstanding and explores not only the failure of the American governance system in Iraq, but also the rise of Iran's influence. And what the point he makes most eloquently is indeed that Iran did not wait for us to push, but has constantly been pushing out from its borders, because its view of itself is not the same as what we say when we see the borders. It is not a post-Westphalian state, it is a pre-Islamic state that is still exploring its areas of influence. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone, and it's certainly a pleasure to serve under the chairmanship of fellow alumnus of the Bromley Borough Council. And can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Aberconwy on securing this debate, although I will highlight one or two differences with his approach afterwards. Can I also make apologies for my honourable friend, the member for Harrow West, who, as members will be aware, had previously been dealing with this issue, as he's departed the front bench to spend more time with the London mayoral elections. This will also, interestingly enough, be my last debate from the front bench on foreign affairs, as I shall be moving to spend more time on politics, and look forward to that. Now, the honourable member for Aberconwy, I think in the way that he introduced it, we may find more common ground between the front benches on this than maybe with some of the government backbenches, which will probably not be the last time in this Parliament that occurs, particularly in the foreign affairs field. But I think what we have to do is define what we see as the objective of our relations with Iran, but particularly in terms of the nuclear talks. And that, is it actually a nuclear freeze? Is it, as has been described, weapons control? Is it to influence Iran's foreign policy, particularly with regard to their actions in respect of their neighbours? Or is it actually to achieve regime change? All of these may be desirable, but they're not necessarily the prime objective of the talks. And an analogy was made between with Eastern Europe and arms control. But arms control with Eastern Europe was immensely successful, as indeed were the Helsinki Accords, which helped to bring about the perestroika and glasnost. Yes.
Giving way. Just to clarify, the analogy with Eastern Europe was made in the context of an agreement which was possibly successful in terms of arms control, but not particularly good for the people of Eastern Europe. And the comment was made that an agreement which might be successful in terms of arms control might not be very good for the people of the Gulf states and indeed of the people of Iran.
That may indeed be true, but it is preferable to having none of those objectives being, to be achieved. Not everything has to be agreed in order for, particularly if we view the possession of nuclear weapons as a qualitative rather than just a quantitative change. It is not just another step. That's been the recognition in arms control agreements right the way throughout their history, that the nuclear threshold is a particular and qualitatively different threshold in relation. So we were able, therefore, to have arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, even though they were repressing their own citizens and also the citizens of Eastern Europe, and even though they were also sponsoring terrorism abroad. They met all of those criteria. I give way to the honourable member for Woodsmith.
Mr. Chairman, for the honourable gentleman giving way. Surely the aim here is to stop a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty from gaining a nuclear weapons capability which both makes a mockery of the treaty itself and provides the opportunity for a much wider risk of nuclear conflict in the region.
I take the right honourable member's point exactly, and in fact he's reinforcing my argument that the fact that there are other undesirable aspects of the Iranian regime should not necessarily mean that we do not seek to achieve a proper and verifiable and effective nuclear agreement. We can argue about how that is achieved, but the other aspects, desirable as they may be, and we should be pressing those with the Iranian regime, they should not actually prevent us from reaching an agreement. But the right honourable member, previous Defence Secretary, is absolutely right. We need to be focusing on the arms control agreement. With the honourable member for South Norfolk, I have to say I wish I had some of his confidence about the internal dynamics of the Iranian regime, and also in his comments about the sponsorship of terrorism. He referred to relations with Hamas and Hezbollah. They are the armourers of Hamas and Hezbollah, and indeed, I think it is reasonably argued, in many cases, are pressing elements and supporting elements who want to take it further within those organisations, compared with those who actually want to have a more moderate position within those organisations. Can I give way to the honourable member for Tunbridge Wells first, and then to the honourable member for Norfolk? No, to the member for Tunbridge Wells first, then the member for
Tunbridge and Morling, forgive me, but the Secretary of State isn't here. Would the honourable member agree that Iran's actions in support of terrorism have actually not just been limited to the region. And though we've heard a lot of talk about IS, the reality is that actions in Argentina, in Bulgaria, murdering of Israeli citizens and indeed European citizens in Germany over the past many years demonstrate that Iran's involvement in terrorism is not, again, a foreign matter, but very much a domestic one.
And indeed also seeking to procure the assassination of the Saudi ambassador in Washington as well. I give way to the honourable member.
Of course, he's right that the Iranians have been sponsoring groups in Gaza and in Lebanon, which we call terrorists. I didn't deny that at all. In fact, I think I said it. I'm simply making the point, that the world is on fire. And it's not on fire because of Iran. It's on fire because George Bush, who didn't know the difference between Shia and Sunni 6 weeks before the invasion, smashed the region, and we're still suffering the consequences. And Iran is trying to help clear up the mess.
I think that is a very simplistic reading of history. And the idea that Islamist terrorism was dependent upon the invasion of Iraq, I do not think bears any scrutiny. Although I did notice it was interesting, yet again, he referred to what we call terrorism. No, it's terrorism. It's what the world calls terrorism, and it is indeed terrorism. Now, I think, therefore, we need to move on to the core questions here, and that is, what is the capability of Iran, and what also is its intention? And it's undoubtedly a complex issue. And we certainly didn't create Iran. Iran is a very long-standing, as the Honourable Member for Tunbridge rightly pointed out, it's a great historic and continuing nation. It's a previous empire and civilization. As the member for Billericay talked about us, we made it a regional power. History, resources, population made Iran a regional power. And interestingly enough, unlike some other Islamist groups, the Iranian regime have not discouraged education. They have very much encouraged education. And there is a substantial educated and indeed sophisticated section of society. Unfortunately, a considerable number of them now live in exile, but would be a huge benefit to a more liberal country. There is clearly very strong internal opposition to the regime, as we saw after the elections with the Green Revolution. Ruthlessly, as the Honourable Member for Tunbridge again said, ruthlessly and shockingly repressed, with frankly too little reaction from the rest of the world. Probably not just a moral but a strategic mistake as well. And widespread executions and imprisonment in absolutely appalling conditions. It also rightly said it's a state with drastically worsening relations with its neighbours. And they rightly accuse it of not only external threats but also fostering internal subversion. There are clearly some legitimate, well-expressed concerns at the internal reactions of some of those neighbouring states as to how to handle the outcome, but equally an understanding of the problems that they face. And this is concerning to the outside world, as it should be for those countries for whom, let's remember, Iran, or the Iranian regime to be more correct, poses an existential threat. Now, I hope that the Minister will address within his reply some of the broader contextual issues. But my concern is that as Britain retreats from the world stage, that we see little evidence of such strategic vision. It's been widely commented on from the United States, being increasingly understood here. Now, that doesn't mean a simplistic division of the world into friends and foes, although a strong reaffirmation of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty would be especially welcome by allies on NATO's Eastern Front, facing increasing Russian assertiveness and pressure. But that doesn't mean that we do not have similar concerns to the Russians in some other parts of the world. Ministers will over the years have heard very clearly the Russian focus on Islamist fundamentalism and what they refer to as the arc of instability to their south. Now, I agree that that's hard to reconcile with the support given by the Russian nuclear industry to the emerging Iranian nuclear program. I've heard the justification from Russian ministers that it's good business. I've also heard the argument put to me that one of the drivers of the Russian approach, rather echoed by the honourable member for Hendon, is the lack of capability of the Iranians to actually run the system. I think that runs against the educated workforce in Iran, and I think maybe is a slightly dismissive, almost colonial position, which I think the Russians are seriously miscalculating of. So I would ask the Minister what efforts have been made to engage with Russia on this, and also what their assessment is as to what, whether there is a unified Russian view or actually diverse views within the Russian hierarchy. Similarly, there is an inconsistency of the Russian view and their involvement with support for the Assad regime, who are most significantly being propped up by the Iranian Hezbollah and also by the Revolutionary Guard. So we don't need to have any illusions about the President Putin's actions in Ukraine, indeed right the way through their western flank up into Scandinavia, to see that there are possibly common interests and concerns in the Middle East and North Africa. Ministers will recall that during the course of the last Parliament, I regularly made similar arguments with regard to Afghanistan and the need for engagement of the neighbours in the post-drawdown settlement in order to ensure stability, and stress that not only should Russia and the stands be involved, but also Iran. And so we do need to have a sort of more broadly spread policy on this. I recognise the Minister needs time to reply, and could I also, just in conclusion, thank him for the courtesy and assistance that he's provided during his time in the Foreign Office, which has indeed been most welcome and appreciated.
I know that the Minister will want to conclude his remarks at 10:57 to allow Guto Bebb the opportunity to reply. The Minister.
I'm grateful, Mr. Hollowburn. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to reply to what I think has been very interesting and informative, an important debate on this side of the negotiations that are taking place. Can I just begin by responding to the very, very kind words for the opposition spokesman? I'm very sorry to hear that this is in fact his valedictory Foreign Office speech that we've been actually hearing today. Well, we will certainly miss him. Had an opportunity to work with the honourable gentleman for over a year now, and it's been a real pleasure. Can I just say that there's been huge cross-party support on this issue and indeed other issues, and that's very much welcome. I'm sorry the energy and enthusiasm that he has shown in this debate is not reflected by some of the Labour backbenchers who elude him in this particular debate. And it's also worth mentioning, Mr. Hollowburn, that perhaps it's too early for the SNP also to make this particular debate. You'd have thought an issue on nuclear might have been something that they'd maybe wishing to engage in. But I'm very grateful that we certainly are having this debate. Can I, as others have, also congratulate my honourable friend for Aberconwy for calling this debate and his continued interest in this matter. We had a very good debate last November, and I do hope that there are further opportunities. I certainly would very much engage so, and through you, Mr. Hollowburn, ask that the Backbench Business Committee offer time for this to be debated on the floor of the House as well as here. For more than a decade, the Iranian nuclear issue has posed one of the most intractable and persistent threats to international security and stability. And the prospect of nuclear weapons-capable Iran carries severe consequences for the security of the UK, the region, and indeed the world. The government has always been clear that the best solution lies in finding a peaceful, diplomatic, and negotiated settlement. And the process has been long and challenging, and the government has been grateful to all sides of this House for their support. Our discussion today comes at a crucial moment, as has been said. The joint plan of action agreed by the E3+3 and Iran in November 2013 and extended in July and November 2014 froze the most concerning elements of Iran's nuclear program in return for limited sanctions relief. When this interim deal was extended in November, we and the E3+3 partners, China, France, Germany, and Russia, and the United States and Iran, set ourselves a deadline of the 30th of June of this month to reach a final comprehensive deal. The UK has played a leading role in diplomatic efforts that secured agreement of the key parameters of the deal in Lausanne on April the 2nd.
This marked an important milestone in the ongoing negotiations, but those negotiations, I make clear, and as has been reiterated today, are not yet complete. And since April, UK diplomats and experts on the E3+3 colleagues have been working intensely to secure a comprehensive agreement by the 30th of June deadline. Now, that agreement, as has been questioned here in this debate, must satisfy the government's objectives, which have remained consistent throughout this process, of preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons capability, whilst also recognising Iran's right to access to nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. We have always been clear that we will not agree to a deal that fails to address our proliferation concerns. My honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, will be present for the talks in Vienna in the coming weeks, where he will maintain a laser-sharp focus on our key UK objectives. But as the deadline draws ever nearer, it is crucial that Iran appreciates what is actually at stake. There are significant economic advantages and political benefits await if Iran agrees to a robust nuclear deal. And honourable friends and members today must forgive me for not going into the detail itself of the deal, but I certainly will try and outline and answer some of those questions. I will very briefly. I do want to get on to the
Thank you,
part
Minister.
of my reply.
Thank you, Minister, very much. It's just that if you do get a deal with Iran, are you absolutely certain that Iran is going to stick to any sort of deal?
Minister.
Well, he's right to raise that question. So what assurances do we have that Iran actually will maintain that? But I will certainly try and answer those questions now. I'm now, to the horror of my team behind me, going to abandon the speech that they've very carefully prepared for me and do my best to answer these questions, which is what I try to do in these debates. My apologies if I don't manage to answer all the detailed questions. I will reread Hansard, not because I like reading what I've said, but because I think it's important that I read what you say and reply to you in writing, if I may, so we can keep that dialogue going. But to begin with, to my old friend who called this debate, first of all, he asked about the intention of the actual agreement. Is it a non-proliferation treaty? It is an arms control treaty. It's a mixture of both. I made it very, very clear. This is important that we are able to maintain, because there are some breakout weapon systems that we're concerned of, in addition to what Iran is doing on the nuclear side at all. But I'll come into more detail about that in due course. He also mentions Iran's foreign policy objectives, not just for its own country, but in the wider region, and I will touch on that a little bit later in response to some of the other concerns. That is a major issue here on Iran's role, where it sees itself in the region, not just in the country itself. There is a responsibility that it has to play in not just in the country itself, but in the wider region, and we look to it to act responsibly in that area. He also mentioned the foreign policy aspect from the United States. Is this a legacy thing? I think my old friend from Tiverton made this point, is that I've never heard that line before, but a president is most dangerous in his second term. You could argue it both ways. He's not tied from anything and therefore is able to be more robust in some of the measures that he or she is actually willing to pursue. But if I may, I'm just going to go through the 8 major headings of the deal itself, which I think might help the House in understanding where the conversation, where the actual agreement is going, leading up to June the 30th. The 8 major headings, which I will cover. The first one, firstly, is all about having a durable and verifiable deal. And the first heading is on enrichment, covering Iran's capacity and its enriched stockpile, and the number of centrifuges obviously is part of that. But I make it clear that whilst numbers of figures have been introduced into this debate today, the actual number is less significant than the breakout time. It is the breakout time, the ability to, if they were to close down the doors, prevent IEA from having the actual inspections, how quickly could they then procure a weapon? So that is called the breakout time, and we've set ourselves 1 year for that to actually happen. So whatever it is, whatever the experts are saying, that then leads you to the number of centrifuges, which we would say would be acceptable. So we're less focused on the actual numbers at this time, but more the breakout time itself. The second area heading is the research and development, covering the types and kinds of centrifuges that this can actually be carried out. And that will be a mutually agreed scope and schedule will be procured from there. Arak, the plutonium reactor, has been mentioned. there will be a redesigning of this reactor to cut off the plutonium route to a nuclear device. Fourthly, Fordo, which has also been mentioned in the debate, will no longer be a site for enrichment of uranium. Fifth area is duration. There are program restrictions in a number of areas, and 10 years has been mentioned as to the extent to which the agreement will be in place. It could very well be that parts of this agreement will go longer than that, parts of it might even be shorter. That is some of the detailed agreements that are now being worked out. Then I touched on this. Sixthly is the possible military dimensions. This is the measures that Iran must address IAEA's concerns about the military dimensions of its nuclear program. And if I was to say if there's one area that is of concern in the discussions at the moment, it would probably be this, which is the most difficult. Seventh is the sanctions, the comprehensive EU and US economic and financial sanctions relief in return for verified actions by the IAEA on Iran's program. An agreement for termination of UN sanctions with limiting transfers of sensitive technologies and activities and others relating to the conventional arms and ballistic missiles. And finally, eighth is the transparency and verification, something which many honourable members have mentioned today, the ability to be able to make sure that they aren't doing anything behind our backs. A robust and credible monitoring programme, including implementation of various protocols to make sure that the IAEA have greater oversight of Iran's activities. I give way to my honourable friend.
Honourable friend for giving way. Will he accept that any verification process that does not have unfettered access will fail to meet its basic objective?
I would agree with my right honourable friend. He's absolutely right. We must have access from that perspective. I'm pleased to say that the IAEA have confirmed that they currently do have the access that they need, but as soon as were that to be closed down, then that is the consequences of what would then happen and whether sanctions would then be brought back into place. If I may turn to the further questions that my right honourable friend raised in this matter, and I acknowledge his understanding and interest in this matter. And he spoke about the Iranians as a proxy power in other parts of the area. And I'm conscious that I'm actually running out of time here, so I will elaborate this point to say that if Iran is looking to seek a more responsible role, as my honourable friend alluded to and encouraged, then we must see Iran take a greater responsibility in what is happening in places like Syria. It is propping up Assad. And by propping up Assad, there is no space being given for moderate Sunnis who are then pushed in or encouraged to then join ISIS. It could very easily assist the international community in moving forward with a political solution to Syria. It could also help immensely in what is actually happening in Anbar and Nineveh province in Iraq, with General Soleimani, for example, pushing across with the Hashad militias, actually causing sectarian friction in Iraq, unhelpful in the long term. Likewise in Yemen, with weapon systems coming by boat, actually providing weapons for the Houthis. This is further complicating what is already a very difficult and complex issue in Yemen. There are ways that Iran could show its initiative and its greater responsibility for the region. And I think that is some of the areas that many honourable members would like to see. And we're not seeing it at the moment, and that is a concern. That is a concern that we have. Mr. Holloburn, I'm conscious of the time. I would like to say that I will write to honourable members with more details. This has been an extremely good debate. I simply make it clear that we are working very hard for the deal, but as has been articulated, we need to make sure that we have the correct deal. If there isn't a correct deal, then we have no deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holloburn. Well, I think it is very important to state that the reason why we needed this Westminster Hall debate was because of the timing issue. This issue is live, this issue is coming to a conclusion, and I'm very grateful for the Minister for the comments that he had made, and in particular for the generous offer to write to honourable members in relation to particular points that were raised during the course of the debates. I do fully understand that the extent of the questions asked and the complexity of the questions asked made it very challenging for the Minister to respond in full in the 12 minutes allocated. I would also like to pay tribute to the Shadow Minister for his final contribution from the front bench. The Shadow Minister did state that he disagreed with the viewpoint that I expressed, but in the course of his comments there were very few disagreements which came to light, but I would like to wish him very well on the back benches. I think what is clear from this debate, therefore, is that there is a real interest, certainly on this side of the House, in this very important issue. The Backbench Business Committee has not as yet been reconvened, so therefore Westminster Hall was the only option to get this issue onto the floor of the House at this point in time. In view of the fact that the Foreign Secretary will be going to Vienna, in view of the interest which is being shown in this issue across the Chamber, I think it is important that a statement is made, perhaps, after the Foreign Minister's visit to Vienna, and certainly when an agreement, if an agreement is reached. Of course I will.
Absolutely, there will be a statement made. There will be an opportunity for the honourable members from all sides to comment. But could I also suggest that when this Backbench Business Committee is formed, if there isn't the opportunity that is provided by government, that we have a full debate on the floor of the House in the aftermath of June the 30th?
Well, I thank the Minister for his comments, and I'm sure there will be delegations going to the Backbench Business Committee. And finally, I would like to say, despite the fact that most speakers have come from the Conservative benches, we are very pleased that there was a degree of opposition, and I should thank the Honourable Member for South Norfolk for his comments, which showed that this was a debate and not just a one-sided discussion.
Agreement. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.